an introduction here. I'm so excited to have Dr. Rachel Ruden um, present as part of our WDA CANUSA webinar series. Dr. Ruden is a wildlife veterinarian with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. She also serves as an affiliate associate professor of veterinary diagnostic and production medicine at Iowa State University Diagnostic Laboratory. Dr. Ruden received her veterinary degree from the University of Pennsylvania and obtained her PhD in wildlife disease ecology from Iowa State University. In her current role, she investigates morbidity and mortality events, leading and contributing to research projects examining the impacts of infectious diseases on free living wildlife populations. And go ahead and take it away when you are ready.
Okay. Thank you, Maris, for that introduction and the invite to present here at this CANUSA webinar series. So I'm really excited. Hopefully, I was really proud of this title, and hopefully I can deliver on the content now. So tonight I thought kind of the angle that might, resonate with people and just be kind of something different is this idea of building community, but also capacity for wildlife health through wildlife health literacy. And so I will talk a little bit about my background and kind of how I got into this position, and then highlight two different projects that I am working on and have been working on for several years that really speak to this, like expanding your capacity when you don't have much, either within your agency or, when you're limited to just what you can do. So, okay. So, a bit about my background. I was thinking about this. I've used this slide before, but I've never kind of framed it. So this is about 10 years of stuff that was packed in from my journey, starting as undergrad animal science major at Cornell University, to the time I actually defended my PhD. It was 10 years. It was a dense 10 years, but there was a lot of personal growth and kind of finding where I wanted to land in the veterinary community during that time. And so, like I said, I started at Cornell University, animal science major. I was very interested in equine medicine, maybe equine surgery. And in my first winter break home, back home, I was watching 60 Minutes, and there was a segment about the Elephant Listening Project, a little known uh, effort that was in the out of the Cornell Lab for Ornithology. So most people know about the Cornell Lab of O because of all their amazing, bird resources like Merlin and different apps and things. But there is also a bioacoustic research program that involves both whales, on one arm, and then a lesser known project called the Elephant Listening Project that focuses on forest elephants and different applications there about learning their life history. And so I started volunteering there, basically that next semester, spring of my freshman year through the time that I graduated. And that really just started expanding my worldview, outside of horses, outside of domestic species, kind of the conservation challenges that were ongoing. This was during the peak of the ivory crisis, which, arguably is still occurring, but it was really at maximum or full threshold back in those days. And so by the time I got to vet school at the University of Pennsylvania, I was already really interested in wildlife and conservation. But where I started my first summer between first and second year is I did an externship, or kind of this exchange program with the University of Pittsburgh. And so I studied tuberculosis in non-human primates, so in macaques, which is very fascinating. It was my first time really doing benchtop research, working with ELISA assays, or ELISAs and those kinds of diagnostic assays. And then also, at least observing necropsies on these primates, and really kind of fascinating first dip of the toe into the disease world. The next summer, so between my second year of vet school and my third year, so that final summer of freedom, I did something that a lot of people thought was kind of wacky. I applied for this program called at the time, I don't believe it currently exists, but it was called the Directorate Resource Assistance Fellowship Program. And so it was designed to, increase capacity and to kind of recruit talent into the Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so I ended up out in Alaska surveying for seabird called the Kitlitz's murrelet out on these glacial lakes near Dillingham, Alaska. So it was really cool. Kind of got to now dip my toe into the wildlife biology world. I still actually did some necropsies while I was out there because there were some murrelets that had been collected incidentally, and I had at least some expertise. Um, to evaluate them. And so that was starting to maybe blend those worlds. And then in my final kind of year at vet school, I also did a certificate in veterinary public health. And for that capstone project, I focused on the endemic bovine tuberculosis situation involving white-tailed deer in the upper lower peninsula of Michigan. And so I had fully solidified that, wildlife is where I wanted to be. Disease was also where I wanted to be. And so right out of that school, I went on to a PhD in wildlife disease ecology at Iowa State, studying house finch conjunctivitis, which is that top photo, and then as a side project, ophidiomycosis, which was the first kind of free-ranging effort to evaluate snakes for ophidiomycosis in the state of Iowa, which was pretty cool. So you might notice that during this time, I never actually entered clinical practice. So I stayed in academia, and then in 2019, right when I was preparing wrapping up my PhD and getting ready to defend my position, ultimately, of being a state wildlife veterinarian for the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, it was advertised that spring. I applied and I landed the job. And so it was a really crazy time to be finishing up a PhD and starting a job that no one had previously occupied, kind of building a program as we went. And now I'm 7 years later, and it's been a wonderful, incredible ride. So hopefully I'll focus on some things that, I worked on and have been working on, and then also learned along the way. But I thought this was kind of a fun place to start. So at the time that this picture was taken, it was maybe 2 weeks into my tenure as the state wildlife vet for Iowa. And I had been on the organizing committee for the first North American WDA student workshop, which has some at least tendrils, threads that connect to this webinar. And so, at the time we were all like, everyone in this picture was students, that we were on our journeys to figuring out who we were going to be and how we were going to contribute to this field. And this is kind of fun to look at. So this is where we landed up, at least currently. So, some of us are epidemiologists, some of us are working in zoo settings and, are in free ranging wildlife. Two of us are state wildlife vets. And so, I think just by being a part of this community, like, you're on your way. And it'll be really fun to see, in 7 years from now, where you all end up. But just a little bit about kind of the wildlife health program. So where I work. So that was established in 2019. Like I mentioned, I was the first hire. The Wildlife Bureau within the Iowa Department of Natural Resources had identified, wildlife health, wildlife disease as this deficiency in the agency that could really use expertise and a dedicated person. And so that's where my position kind of originated. It was organically identified, as this need that needed to be filled. And so I started in July 2019. The wildlife health program, I like to say it's a program, but it is actually just me. And so hopefully down the line, there'll be, program staff added. But currently it's coordinated by the state wildlife vet, myself, who's housed at the ISU Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory. And so that's where I actually work. That's kind of unique, not unique within the state agency. Like lots of times we're embedded in different, maybe partner offices and things like that. But my particular position is the only one that's at the vet diagnostic lab. And so I'm working with diagnosticians, that are most of the time they're domestic animal specialists, especially swine in the state of Iowa, and poultry. But that leads to a lot of synergism that you really couldn't imagine, unless you're in that context, kind of dealing with similar issues together. And so what I actually work on throughout, my days is consultations. That might be with staff within the agency, outside the agency, the public. I get direct calls from the public too. Staff support, so that might be on projects. Like we have a long-term wild turkey project that we're in year 5 of. Gray Fox project, some of these like live animal capture related projects. Morbidity and mortality investigations, I would say that's my bread and butter. That's what I do a lot of, and I really enjoy. I do all of our necropsies and then work with pathologists to do the histopath on those cases. Monitoring and surveillance, which it seems like there's an endless need for. Since I started, we've had, SARS-CoV-2, we've had rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus, we've had, avian influenza, high path, come through. So a lot of need there, as well as, expanding footprints of other diseases like chronic wasting disease. And then I do quite a bit of work with the media. So, interviews, consulting with, journalists as they're working on a story, that kind of thing too. And then, as part of the kind of creation of my position, there was this vision to have me embedded at the vet school. And so 20% of my time is actually dedicated to those vet school activities. So I'm a chronic wasting disease case coordinator. So all of the testing basically happening in our state for chronic wasting disease, I sign off on. So that can include DNR surveillance samples and also hunter submitted samples, which is a separate kind of throughput. And then this has been something I've been really kind of pushing and proud of, is expanding wildlife diagnostic access. And so we now have lymphoproliferative disease virus available, PCR available for wild turkeys, pseudogymnoaspis destructans, so the cause of age of white nose syndrome, which we use on guano frequently, and then we can also use, direct swabs on bats. And then ophidiomycosis, so formerly snake fungal disease, kind of a throwback to my PhD days, but now working with rattlesnakes and sympatric species. And so, working in the state of Iowa, I thought that this is just kind of helpful, to give you this context. So this is the keep in minds. And so, Iowa is considered the most altered landscape in the country. That's not something that I'm particularly proud of, but it's what we're working with. And so the images on the right, so the top shows that kind of golden color would have been prairie, and then the green color would be forest. And so in that lower picture, the kind of gray beige color, that's row crop agriculture. So that's corn and soybeans primarily. So you can see how much of the natural landscape has been removed and straightened in some cases in terms of creeks and rivers and things like that. But that also is really important to keep in mind that because it's in production, also we are the 49th state in terms of public land access. And so 97% of our state is in private land holding. We have limited agency staff. So, like we have one deer biologist, we have one upland game biologist, we have one state wildlife vet or, wildlife health specialist. So, these are all the things that we are, this is where the cards have fallen. And now, like, what we can do about it is we do have some unique aspects, like this system of 99 county conservation boards. And so this is actually in state law that established these county conservation boards. We have 99 counties, so that's why there's 99. And so each county has its own, entity that's managing the natural resources of the county land. Oftentimes in collaboration with the state agency, the DNR. And then there's just, of course, because most of the land is private, there's just lots of opportunities and need to engage with the public to understand what's really going on here. So if we focus on our public lands, we'd only have, a snippet of the picture. And so where I thought we'd start is, building the community and building the capacity is this program that we started back in 2021 called Chronic Wasting Disease Ambassadors. And so this is a collaborative educational program developed between the Iowa DNR and then Iowa State University Extension Outreach. So there's really three of us that are the core kind of members of this team that administer this curriculum. So we give it over 3 weeks. And so there's three in-person sessions that people have to come to. We expect them to come to all three. Sometimes people misunderstand. They think it's a one-off, offering. They're really, highly interactive. The whole point is to kind of network, with the people who are in the class with you, and then collaborate. And just to ask all of the questions, like this is a course that goes really deep into the weeds. So we don't need like the broad strokes about chronic wasting disease and, the asymptomatic period. We want to know like, what does it bind to in the soil? Like we're going in as deep as we can, and getting comfortable with the uncertainties that continue to exist around this disease, which is very much true. So we do these like interactive in-person sessions 3 times, and then in between those, we have online sessions where we deliver the core content. So this is more like lecture style. It's called a flipped classroom approach. So we're kind of cementing what they learn in those online sessions, the next interactive session. So that's kind of the idea here. And so what that looks like what we're actually talking about. So the first online sessions are, what the basics about the disease and about prion diseases. I give a lecture on the testing, like what we actually do to test for chronic wasting disease. And then also a pretty interesting lecture on the species barrier. This is actually the same lecture I give to every second-year vet student that goes through Iowa State vet school. And so talking about, how the host range can shift when it's cycling through additional hosts and just like some of the really peculiarities, of prion diseases. The second in-person session, we focus on actually practicing sampling deer. That's where the capacity comes in. So we could teach, people, and then they could still rely on us to take their samples, and that would be fine. But this is a long-term issue. And so the idea is that they're investing in that, training to know how to collect their samples, be cognizant of testing when they're, harvesting and consuming deer, those kinds of things. Then in between, we have an online lecture about, the management side, like the deer biology and management side, and then also communication and how to effectively communicate about this disease. Because once they learn about it, we also want them to share their knowledge with others and kind of myth bust, oh my gosh, as they go, as they hear things that are not quite right. And then that third session is really fun. We have them practice those skills. We actually have them talk about like, what are the core facts about CWD? What would you say to a hunter? What would you say to a landowner? And then we give them these cards as like a quick reference, but it's all the stuff that they've already learned throughout the course. So it's like really reinforcing of the course content. And then they graduate, which is always fun. The objective here is just to, again, expand the capacity by developing this network of informed and engaged community members. And so we actually gear the same curriculum towards 2 audiences. So one audience is just the public. So people who are hunting, people who own land, people who have any interest in deer or animals at all. Anyone can kind of self-enroll in this course when we're offering it. And the other audience is our natural resource professionals. So in Iowa, that's often targeting those those county conservation board staff members. But it can also be taxidermists. It can also be veterinarians, who are working with captive deer. Like that can really span the gamut. And we try to deliver this curriculum about 3 times per year, but up to 6 times actually per year. So we we'll piggyback it. So maybe we'll have an evening session one day, and then the next morning, especially if we're out, 3 hours away in Western Iowa, we'll do another session in the morning. And so the evening will be geared towards the, the public, the community, and then the morning session will be geared towards those natural resource professionals. And a really fun part that I don't think I necessarily anticipated, but it makes sense once you give curriculum, time and again. So we're up to 17 offerings. You kind of land on these key messages or the things that you find that resonate with people or just are kind of the quick takeaways. Like if you know nothing else, like we're trying to, build consensus around making informed consumption decisions. So if you choose not to test your deer, that is totally fine. At least you knew that testing was an option and why you might consider it. And so that's like one of the, I would say, like the flagship takeaways from our program. But then also figuring out how to find a resonant message when you have a diverse public, a public that might be misinformed, a public that just might not care particularly, if they're in urban centers and they're not engaged in hunting and consuming venison, like they just don't feel like deer really affect them. And so we've landed on kind of these three groups of messages. So, you might care about chronic wasting disease because it's actually a deer health issue. And, a deer that contracts it will end up dying from it if it's not taken out first, by something else. If that, if the basic biology of the disease doesn't matter, then maybe your hunting tradition, your heritage, going after, mature male deer, those mature males won't exist, long term. Like they won't reach those higher age classes and maybe those, larger antler sizes, with this disease in play. And then what I, always find the most resonant to me, but not always to the public, is just that public health question. Like we don't know if this is transmissible to people. And so that in itself is a reason that you might want to consider testing. And so always landing back on that, making informed consumption decisions. So as of this past fall, we've had over 220 graduates, which is really exciting. We actually have 2 courses slated for the end of this month. So in central Iowa, so around the Des Moines metro, and then right around Ames. So we're just, continuing to expand and hopefully, in time, like we don't know if this is the right approach or the best approach, but this is something that at least we are invested in, and having an informed public, it seems like that can never, go wrong. like it might not mean that the disease, that we're able to keep it at bay. That's kind of like the whole challenge with chronic wasting disease is it finds a way to continue to expand, locally and increase in prevalence and then also geographically. But, people know about it and at least like we're doing that public service. So this is just some pictures from we always take a class photo. I always kind of demand it. And so this is like the visual picture of expanding your capacity, building your community around wildlife health issues. And so we do have a manuscript, back in our first several sessions of this or cycles of this, we did actually, test people. They took a pre-test and then a post-test where they would score, we would score their knowledge about chronic wasting disease. And, we saw clear improvement, after going through the course, which is what you would hope to expect. But we also saw, like their self-assessment improved. Like they felt confident to talk about this disease, to pull their own samples, those kinds of aspects. And so we do have a manuscript in prep that will kind of encompass all of those details. And importantly, I think most importantly, that manuscript as one of the appendices will include the course manual. So, the idea has always been, we're doing this in Iowa. We found what kind of works here in terms of, there's 3 of us that kind of work really well together. But we would love to see this, expand to other states or, other geographies at least. And so having that course manual is important. And then on the continuing education, continuing to engage with the community. So we've built the community. Now we need to like keep them, involved and active. And so we do produce a biannual newsletter. We know newsletter, like how many newsletters do we all receive that we never take a look at. But we are hoping to have everyone come together this year in particular, because we're at our 5-year anniversary since the start of this project, and have this anniversary summit. It would be kind of the traditional continuing education, like have some real lectures involved with this. Have some like standard, updates to some of the curriculum, that kind of thing, have maybe some guest speakers, maybe from out of state, just get different faces and voices in the mix. But also just, like see our community again and bond. And the way we've had it now with these 17 offerings, we have people from like the Northeast, but they were in different sessions. And so they never met each other. And so just kind of breaking down some of those barriers regionally so that they can kind of know who's in their community locally. This is another kind of fun extension of the CWD work. And so, we sample real deer in week 2. So we, have roadkill deer or occasionally hunter harvest or whatever, depending on the time of year that we practice sampling. But it's not necessarily easy to have at like a fair, like a county fair situation or in a classroom with children. So this is a little friendlier version. So I actually worked with this wonderful puppeteer, Amanda Pete Verschrag, on developing these deer puppets. And so we can actually, and they currently are kind of touring the state, going into classrooms, going into different venues, and just showing like the very basics. Like it's not a perfect, recapitulation of how to pull a CWD sample, but it kind of gets you intrigued when you see a giant deer head. That's happened when I bring them up to my office in the vet diagnostic lab. Like people who, see animals all the time, they're like, what are you doing with a giant deer head? And so it's been a fun kind of extension of this work for outreach and extension. And if you can see here, so there's these stress balls. So there is an insert that's just kind of the traditional, quasi lymph node that we have in there. But we can also trade it out with these stress balls that have a QR code to our hunter submission webpage and like how to pull your own sample. So it's all tied in, and then it's like a takeaway that people can take once they interact with the puppet. They can take a stress ball and then remember how to get back in touch with us. Okay, so that's my hard transition to a different disease. so, um, so disease impacts at scale. So we're at the 20-year kind of anniversary, unfortunately, of white nose syndrome first being detected in North America. And so the next series of slides will cover a different kind of dimension of a project that also really leans on community support to get it off the ground. And so here's just a little bit of overview and context. So white nose syndrome, it's caused these really severe declines of some North American bat species, with estimates in excess of 90% of species like northern long-eared bats, little brown bats, and tricolored bats, all of which are year-round residents in Iowa. There's also this different dimension, the loss of essential ecosystem services, that's been valued, this loss of natural capital at almost $500 million. And so even if if people don't care about bats, they don't want them in their attics, they don't want them in their houses, they're worried about rabies, there's also this real value to the economy of not having bats on the landscape. And so this map might be familiar. So it's the kind of most recently updated version, through 2025 of where either the fungus, PD, or actually white nose syndrome affected bats have been detected across North America. And so, as the iterations each year, as the years have gone by, we've seen the colors get a lot tighter. Like it's a little bit harder to tell exactly where you fall in those much earlier years. But what we can definitely tell is that it's gone from East Coast to West Coast. It's pretty solidly, has a foothold in the West now too. But there are a lot of gaps and blanks. Like if you look at Iowa, even from this level, it's mostly just an island around just a couple of detections. And so if we zoom in to an earlier rendition, so these are the maps that I had when I started back in 2019. And so I produce a Fish and Wildlife Health Committee report of kind of activities related to wildlife health in Iowa. And I would include this map on the right for several years. So I started in 2019. By 2021, I was kind of sick of including this map because I felt like it was not being honest. Like we had these detections. So if you look at the text, so PD, so the fungus was first detected back in 2011, but kind of when things kind of got going in 2015 into 2016, that's when we had white nose syndrome affected bats. And in only a couple of places and mostly on the eastern coast, what I say, the eastern coast of Iowa, so along the Mississippi River. There were a couple PD detections in central Iowa, but other than that, it's not that they weren't detected in those other counties, um, or that there had been any effort. Like that's what I felt uncomfortable with. It seemed as if we were trying to detect it in other places and we hadn't, versus, they just hadn't been detected in those other places. And so this was really kind of festering in me as like a point of contention. Um, and so then I started looking into guano surveillance. So this isn't like a novel concept. The idea is that you detect the fungus that's been literally, like, physically groomed off of the bat, either when they're grooming themselves or grooming their neighbors, and then swallowed, digested, and then comes out in their guano or feces. The target is generally the first 4 weeks after spring emergence. Um, and you can carry it out anywhere. USGS uses this in high priority areas like along the leading edge, which, like we just established, we're already on the West Coast now, but there's a lot of gaps to fill. They often are focusing on myotis species, so the more vulnerable species, not that interested in big brown bats, for instance, which are both more resistant to infection and also more tolerant to disease. Um, and a lot of times you'll find PD. This is just like more for the basic background on the disease. You'll oftentimes find the fungus before you find affected bats or bats that were affected by white nose syndrome. But in this case, we're really just worried about the PD detections. And so we rolled out this project in 2022 with 8 county partners. So some of these partners were state parks, which is kind of pictured in this photo. Many of them, most of them, were county conservation board partners. And so it was very basic. This was in consultation with USGS, like, how do we do guano surveillance? I thought it was going to be like this complex situation, which processing the guano does have its complexities for sure. But actually collecting the guano, they were like, just put out a cookie sheet. And I was like, oh, like that's like very accessible and cheap, thank God. And so we just, outfitted our partners with cookie sheets and vials. The first year we had these paper or toilet paper holders to be like the vial, stabilizers and stuff. We've since kind of upgraded and modernized a little bit. But this is the basics. Like, we're just collecting guano where guano accumulates, like at these sites where guano is known to accumulate in the past. And then we screen it for the fungus that causes white nose syndrome, so Pseudogymnoascus destructans. Um, Depending on where your site is, it might have some practical limitations. Like if it's surrounded by prairie, a cookie sheet doesn't lay that flat on prairie, or when there's high wind and stuff like that. And so this was Jones County Conservation Board. They actually put up chicken waterers. They affixed them to the poles that the bat boxes were on. And so that was like a really effective way of getting the guano, but also not, like being easy site to maintain instead of having the full cookie sheet. And this is a site that just came on this year. So this is down in Polk County, which is basically, the Des Moines metro area. And so these are volunteers. So this is coordinated by Polk County Conservation, but then these are volunteers, so just members of the public that had an interest, and were invested in the health of their communities, including their bat communities. And so they were collecting the samples. And interestingly, when they were out there collecting the guano samples, they also noticed that there were dead baby bats, or baby bats, some of which had already died, some of which were alive. And so they actually installed what's called a pup catcher, because they saw that there was like this issue. Sometimes those bat boxes, when they're containing a maternity roost, those colonies just get large and kind of, they can get overheated, or they can, be pretty constrained on space. And so pups fall out, they can't get back in, and then they perish unless they, make it to a rehabber maybe. So this device allows a pup that falls out to actually climb back in to the roost. And so like they were invested in a very particular way, not just in the guano and the project, but, really trying to improve the site. They knew the angle that the sun hit it and how many hours, like they really were understanding the bat biology involved here, which was really cool. And so the fun part, this is samples analyzed to date. So we've been doing this since 2022. So we're starting our fifth year of this project. We have collected, over 200 guano samples from 32 sites across 19 counties. So up from, the seven, I think that we started with, we're at 19 now. We just collect one vial per roost. Once per week from early May to early June. So that's targeting, it's maybe not perfectly the first 4 weeks post spring emergence, but it's when there's at least a number of bats using the site that we feel like we're getting a good representative sample. We've landed on testing 20 pellets per 25 milliliters of guano that are collected, and then we run that in triplicate. And the idea is to sunset a site after they have participated for 3 years. So we're trying to build and kind of populate that map, fill in the map with surveillance data, not necessarily, though you'll see one deviation from this, not necessarily keep the same sites online long term. Um, and yeah, we've had detections at 8 sites in 4 counties that previously had no baseline data. Interestingly, and I think it'll be, yeah, on this next slide. So this is that map. So historic detections of white nose syndrome affected bats are in the dark, the filled dots. The open dots are where there's just PD detections. The purple is where we've had PD positive detections. And then the orange is where we haven't detected the fungus, at least so far. Interestingly, you'll see that 4 of these sites actually had white nose syndrome affected bats, but at the sites that we're sampling, and at least in this case for Des Moines County, it's the same site that had white nose syndrome affected bats. We're not detecting even the fungus, which, could be for many different factors. Like the bats actually don't use these sites, they're different sites. In the case of the Des Moines, this is actually a natural cave site. It could be that the bats, unfortunately died. And so maybe the fungus never took off there because they died, quickly, or something like that. And so, it has to be interpreted appropriately, but we're like on our way to at least knowing kind of the real borders of where PD occurs in our state. So next steps, this is where I said, the intention is to transition sites after 3 years to sunset them. But in one of our sites, Jones County, we've had such a consistent signal over the years that we're actually bringing on a master's student to help figure out what's going on in terms of how many bats are actually shedding in their feces that PD, DNA signal that we're detecting in the guano. So we're going to be catching bats for the first time at the site and sampling that, skin swabbing them to know their individual, positive or negative status. And then monitoring the guano also long term throughout the summer for a longer or elongated period of time to understand how that guano detection kind of fits into that larger picture. And then we're pit tagging the bats, so we know who is contributing the guano at those sites based on occupancy of the bat boxes. And, like a project like this, especially when you're with a state agency, oftentimes it can't happen alone. And so, the whole idea is collaboration. We have a bat expert, Dr. Benedict out of Central College, which is in central Iowa as well, Jones County Conservation Board staff. So it turns out that their director, Brad, actually did his master's on bats. And so he has a particular interest. So there's a lot of good synergism. And then our master's student is actually from the same county as Jones County, where we're going to be doing this work. So it's just a cool kind of organic story that's developed there. Okay. And then I just thought, so that's kind of the end of my, like the projects I wanted to highlight, but I thought just some reflections over the past, maybe 7 years in this job. And you, I'm sure, have heard this before, but the wildlife health community is really small. Like it's definitely growing, but we're still really small. And the people that you might meet, on a webinar like this, or if you go to WDA this summer, you might be like in that same sphere of influence for years to come, like working on the same disease system, popping in and out of each other's disease systems, things like that. So it's really fun. the other part, which is just kind of interesting, like when I started, I mean, I ended up highlighting chronic wasting disease project and a white nose syndrome related, adjacent project. Like those are two diseases that I thought, if I was like looking in, I would think that they, all the questions have been asked, like there's not much room for more people. And like it turns out there's plenty of space. And so even these diseases that I perceived as saturated, like there's plenty of opportunity to ask novel questions or have novel contributions. And so like just never feel like you don't have a place at this kind of table. Everyone's invited and we need you. There will be plenty of curveballs. So like starting and then maybe 4 months in, SARS-CoV-2 coming online hot, and having to figure out the implications, obviously for all of us living through it, but then also for wildlife was really a pretty hectic time. And now like living through avian influenza, and its cycles, it's just, and who knows what's coming down the line. And so again, we need you. We need all of you. And then I just wanted to touch on this just a tiny bit. So I do feel like I interact with the media, like TV, radio, other written like newspapers, things like that, pretty frequently. And I think that the media really can be a key player in building wildlife health literacy because people will see a flashy story, but if you can like also insert some of the context, like I always try to, even like let's say white nose syndrome. So people have kind of the word association of like bats, and they know that there's like this fungus or this disease that kills them, but then they'll report a bat in August and say, well, are you going to test it for white nose or, that fungus thing? And just like understanding that there's certain times a year that we would focus on those kinds of diseases or expect them to present, just building that into the media story, I think is really valuable and something that I try to be really cognizant and intentional with. And yeah, thanks for attending. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that presentation. I absolutely loved it. It was really great to hear about. And especially your reflections at the end. I know definitely as a like a young student scientist, I really appreciate hearing those words from someone in our field. So thank you so much. Um, Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, they can type it in the chat or feel free to raise your hand. While you ponder, I will kick off the question asking. And so the first one that I would like to ask is, what do you think was like the hardest part about like this capacity building? Like it seems like you have a lot of help from people within the community or like within those counties, like when you have your CWD presentations or like courses, a lot of people seem to be attending those. I know at Illinois, we definitely have a harder time kind of like engaging with the public and getting them to sort of like buy in. What were some of those challenges that maybe you faced during that process?
Yeah, so I think it's still kind of like specifically for CWD ambassadors, it's not like it has name recognition yet. Like,
Hmm.
unless you're kind of in the community or you've seen the advertisements, like it's
Hmm.
not like someone would say, oh, I'm a CWD ambassador and like really know what that means. Um, but I think I mean, targeting natural resource professionals, it's kind of like you already have the common ground. Like you're both
Hmm.
managing the same resource. And so there's been a real appetite for understanding more and being able to field questions better when they get like these oddball, curveball questions from the public. So that already existed, which is really helpful. On the public side, interestingly, I mean, there could be a scenario where the people who would come would be kind of like antagonistic and like disbelieving of the disease. And like we know that that's out there on social media, that kind of sentiment. I think the people who end up committing, 6 hours and then plus the online material hours,
Yeah.
they are kind of like genuinely curious or they've heard about it and they kind of want to know what the truth is. And like they just want to hear it like from a resource that they trust. Now,
Hmm.
I think in Iowa specifically, like we have a pretty good relationship with the public. Like the Iowa DNR is still considered a trusted source that can vary across states. But also having the Iowa State Extension outreach component, like they're the ones who are ultimately like delivering the material. All of the communication comes from my colleague Adam Janke.
Mm,
And so like there's, we're a land grant institution at ISU. And so that's supposed to be the community resource, like where you get the information to, answer whatever challenges you're having. And so I think that can also help. And maybe in some states, like it just being through the extension outreach arm and like less of a state agency or management agency kind of involvement could be necessary, but it's really valuable to have the biologists there too. So
for sure. Awesome. Cool. Thank you for that response.
yeah,
We have another question in the chat. It says, do you have any recommendations on how to get comfortable such experience interacting with the media?
yeah, that's a great question. Um, there are like media trainings, like so. I did a um something called Emerging Wildlife Conservation Leaders, UCL. So it's this training program. It's like a leadership kind of training program. I did that, and there was like specific material geared towards, media or like interacting with complex or like kind of hot button issues. Um, I think they exist. Other than that one opportunity, like I haven't really used them. I've kind of done my learning on the job, and I think I'm kind of like you can kind of intuit what I mean, once you know what your agency is comfortable talking about, that's also really important. Like when you work for a state agency, like you don't want to be getting out ahead of a story before, everyone's aware, before your partners are aware. But yeah, like you kind of just have to go through it a little bit. Like there's, you could practice, but like I think actually being on the spot, like, is different. Like I always have struggled with practicing presentations even, like I feel like I'm better when I deliver it live. I don't know if that's true because I've never really tried the alternative, but yeah, and you kind of learn like the language that you want to use. And I think just having like you have to be kind of kind to yourself, give yourself grace when you don't answer something perfect. But most of the time, there are like issues that like influenza is affecting every state, like in the country. Like there's very little that you could say that would be so inflammatory, unintentionally, because it's already being covered and everyone knows about it. But yeah, just being aware of like what the guardrails might be for your particular entity that you're representing, I think is most important, more so than what you're actually going to say.
Mm, great. Super helpful. Thanks. So cool. Any other questions for Dr. Rudin?
I can
Uh,
say what's in the
okay.
picture.
Oh yeah,
it's
tell us.
it's a killdeer. So during the early years, like 2022 into 2024, I focused on shorebird surveillance to kind of understand, what was going on in Iowa with influenza, especially killdeer that are very, very abundant at poultry facilities. And so, not that these nesting killdeer were at the poultry facilities, but we did some like zero surveillance and, swabs to run PCRs to understand if they were involved in the equation, and we never found any killdeer that were positive. But sometimes we would miss our mark on, finding a nest in time. And so on just a couple of occasions, they were already chicks instead of eggs that we would put our cage trap over
Oh my gosh, it's so
or a
cute.
walk-in trap. Yeah.
How does your position like guide the projects that you get to work on? Like, are you funded by the state or do you get to like kind of pick and choose your like surveillance projects or are they kind of like assigned to you in a way?
Yeah. So I think like, so part of this could be like truly how like where I fall within my agency. So like
Mm,
my program falls within the research section of the Wildlife Bureau. And so all wildlife like fit under that umbrella and like technically also fish, though I do very little on the fish side. Um, but there are agencies where, like you're just going to be like the avian, health, you know, um, point person or the mammal or reptile or whatever, or
Hmm.
even how where your program falls under. Like you might only work with game species or diversity species, like the non-game species. And so for me, like anything is really eligible. So I guess just to
Hmm.
start out with that context. Um, so being the first person in this position, um, you know, it is a little bit like I can decide what my priorities are, but of course, also realizing that there's certain things that are like non-negotiables, like chronic wasting disease. I would say like non-negotiable. Like that's always going to be something that I'm working on. And it turns out that it's a really fascinating disease, and that I have a lot of passion for teaching and thinking about it. Um, avian influenza. Um, Another one of those where it's like you can't really not be thinking about it, especially if there's only one of you to do any of the thinking. Some of the things like with the guano surveillance and my like ophidiomycosis work on rattlesnakes, like that really is just a priority that I thought was important, like for
Hmm.
understanding these species that are declining or are at least population limited. Like our rattlesnakes are really, the populations are extremely fragmented. And so understanding what other pressures might be there other than like the true bottlenecks that exist was, important to me. The shorebird work, that came out of, I mean, there was a funding opportunity related to influenza, but it was kind of like an angle that I thought satisfied both the poultry side with like what's the real risk of killdeer, and then also like this true knowledge gap. Like there's very little information on shorebird, disease status, especially when they're migrating through the interior US. So, there's a ton of work done in the Delaware Bay and like in parts of Australia and stuff, but there's not much shorebird work done generally, but then also in places that have like high poultry densities and things like that, if they're truly a reservoir, which for high path is, I think, probably pretty unlikely at this point. So some of it's opportunistic and kind of pivoting where the money might lead you, but with like a real question in mind, like a question that's worth asking and answering. But yeah, I'm trying to think of, I'm dabbling a little bit with epizootic hemorrhagic disease and like serology instead of just the carcass count kind of side. So that's been kind of fun to navigate through. But there, a lot of the diseases kind of tend to announce themselves, and then you realize that like you really have to pay attention to them.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Um, and then not to hog the Q&A, but I'll ask one last question. And my, I was wondering if I know like the way your job kind of opened up, you were able to go right from PhD to having this super awesome position. You've enjoyed it, which is great. Do you ever wish that you had had more like clinical experience? Like, I feel like it's kind of a mixed bag when I talk to people. They're always like, make sure you take time to get clinical experience. And other people are like, I'm glad I never got clinical experience and just like am doing what I like. Do you have any like, do you ever reflect on that or like have any opinions on that?
Yeah. So I think, I think where clinical experience to me, like the biggest deficiency, like if I were to have to deal with a bunch of capturing of ungulates, and station procedures and stuff like I would really want to hone up my skills and like practice
Yeah.
that. And it's not something like, and it just turns out this way. Like we don't do that much in the state. Like at least in the time that I've been in here, and projects that I'm aware of in the future, like we're not capturing deer, for instance. But we are doing tons of like turkey work and shorebird work, and well, through the limited projects that I work on, and we have a gray fox project, and so in those circumstances, I still, and I guess like one piece too is like in my PhD, I was working with birds, and so there was a lot of sampling. There was necropsies, there was like swabbing, and different and taking blood samples. So it wasn't like treating a patient; it was
Hmm.
inoculating them with the disease. But there was a lot of like exercising some of those skills at least. And I think like by and large with the stuff that I do on the live animal side, like I feel very confident with with birds and with sampling. I wouldn't do like surgeries per se, but that's also not the nature of my job, or at least my position here. I think where it could crop up and be maybe just hard to know is like if I were to, transition to another state where that need was really important, to be able to
Mm.
knock down pronghorn and bison or whatever. And I think, like we always say with vet med, like the skills are very transferable, and like you always have that foundation. And so not that everyone here is necessarily a veterinarian, but I think that's always the case. Like you might pull something from one discipline into another, or one disease system into another, and so it's never like, oh, I guess you can't do any of that work anymore, because you didn't do it from the beginning. I think there's time to learn and opportunity. So
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, when you're in it and you really just are like, okay, it's a hard stop to clinical, practice. I just didn't have the passion for it. I
Mm.
like the application in this, like the realm that I work in. But yeah, totally am so happy to collaborate with people who are clinically oriented.
Yeah, I totally get that. Cool. Well, thank you so much. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I really appreciated your presentation. It was really, really great. And from all of CANUSA, we thank you so much for taking the time. And we hope you have a good rest of your night, good rest of the spring, and hopefully we'll see you in Chicago this summer.
Thank you. Absolutely. I'll look out for y'all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.